There's a specific moment a lot of us can point to. Not the moment you started making art. Most people can't even locate that one. It's too far back, too mixed up with childhood. I mean the other moment. The one where you stopped calling it a hobby out loud. Where someone asked, "So what do you do?" And instead of saying, "I dabble in painting," you said, "I'm a painter." Nothing about your actual output changed that day. Same skill level, same half-finished canvases in the closet, same fear. But something shifted anyway, and it's worth understanding what, because it turns out that shift is doing more work than the skill itself. The failure you sign up for. Let's start with the uncomfortable part, because I think it's the part most just believe in yourself content skips. The moment you take your art seriously, you become eligible for a very specific kind of suffering, the fear of being found out. Researchers who study creative fields have found imposter syndrome runs dramatically higher there than almost anywhere else. Roughly 7 in 10 people experience it at some point in their lives, but narrow that down to creative industries specifically, and the number climbs to somewhere around 87%. That's not a fringe experience. That's nearly everyone. So if you took your art seriously last month and now you feel like a fraud, I need you to hear this clearly. That's not evidence you made a mistake. That's the median experience of literally every serious artist. The imposter feeling isn't a signal you're in the wrong place. It's practically an admission fee. And here's the part that took me a while to actually believe. The feeling gets worse, not better, as you get more serious, at least for a while. This tracks with something psychologists have documented in identity research more broadly, that adopting a new identity creates what's sometimes called identity defense, where the old self-concept pushes back against the new one because the new behavior threatens it. You're not imagining the internal resistance. It's a documented mechanism, not a personal failing. The part of you that used to get to hide behind, "I just do this for fun," is losing its alibi, and it does not go quietly. So why do it at all? Why take the label seriously if the label just invites more anxiety? 2 words that change your brain's instructions. Because the label is doing something underneath the anxiety that's much bigger than the anxiety itself. This is where it gets genuinely interesting, because there's real research on what identity does to behavior, and it's not subtle. One of the more well-known studies, published in the Journal of Consumer Research, split people into 2 groups facing a food temptation. One group was told to say, "I can't have this," when tempted. The other group said, "I don't do this." Same behavior goal, totally different frame. At the end of the study, when everyone was offered a treat as a thank you, the group using "I don't" chose the healthier option at nearly double the rate of the other group. 2 words. That's the entire difference between the groups. "I can't" describes a rule being imposed on you. "I don't" describes who you are. And apparently your brain treats those as almost entirely different instructions. Now translate that to art. "I can't skip writing today" is a rule, and rules get negotiated with. You're tired, it's been a long week, surely one day won't matter. "I don't skip writing" is identity, and identity doesn't get negotiated with nearly as easily, because breaking it doesn't just cost you a day of output, it costs you the story you're telling about who you are. That's a much higher price, and your brain knows it, which is exactly why it holds. Why "once I have more time" never works. This is also, I think, why "I'll take this seriously once I have more time" never actually works as a plan. It has the causality backwards. The research on identity change consistently finds that the shift starts small, a modest first behavior prompted by some internal friction between what you value and what you've been settling for. And the confidence and self-concept build after that, not before. You don't get the identity as a reward for already being good. You install the identity first in some small, deliberate act, and competence gets pulled along in its wake. One study that pulled together findings across more than a dozen behavior change contexts described the process as beginning with a value conflict, a moment where the gap between what you say matters to you and how you're actually living becomes too obvious to keep ignoring, which prompts one small step, and if that step holds, the identity shift takes over from there, with self-awareness and confidence building on each other after that first foothold, not before it. Notice what that means practically. It means the moment you decide to take your art seriously isn't a finish line you cross after getting good enough. It's the value conflict resolving. It's the point where the gap between I think of myself as someone who writes and I haven't opened the document in 3 weeks got loud enough that you couldn't keep living in it. The decision is downstream of discomfort, not downstream of confidence. Which means if you're waiting to feel confident before you take yourself seriously, you have the sequence backwards and you'll wait a very long time because confidence is the thing that shows up after, as a consequence of the identity, not before it, as a prerequisite. The research on creative personal identity. There's a specific term researchers who study creativity at work use for this: creative personal identity, meaning the degree to which creativity sits at the center of how someone sees themselves, distinct from how skilled they actually believe they are. Studies on this construct have found something worth sitting with. Creative personal identity predicts creative output above and beyond a person's actual confidence in their own ability, and the two don't even need to move together. In plain terms, deciding creativity is central to who you are does independent work that skill confidence alone can't do. People with a strong creative personal identity are more likely to keep producing, specifically because not producing would now contradict who they've decided they are, not because they've calculated they're good enough to bother. The part nobody puts in the pep talk. There's also something researchers keep finding about connection that I think gets underweighted in how we talk about taking your art seriously, because we tend to frame it as a private, internal decision, a mindset shift you have alone in a room. But the evidence on identity change points somewhere else. Across a wide review of interventions that successfully shifted how people saw themselves, the majority of the qualitative findings pointed to one mechanism above the others: forming connections with other people engaged in the same meaningful pursuit. Not motivation, not discipline, relationship. The people whose identity shift actually held were disproportionately people who found some form of "these are my people now," be a workshop, a studio, a group of others who took the same thing seriously and reflected that seriousness back at them. Identity, in other words, isn't just something you decide, it's something that gets confirmed repeatedly by the people around you or it erodes, which explains something a lot of artists live but rarely name. Why the identity feels so fragile around people who knew you before, and so much sturdier around people who only ever knew you as the serious version. It's not about them being unkind. It's that identity is partly a social object, held in place by mirrors, and if the mirrors around you are still reflecting the old version, the new one has to do all the holding by itself. That's exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with talent. The trade nobody warns you about. There's one more thing worth saying because it's the part that usually gets left out when this topic turns into a pep talk. Taking your art seriously doesn't feel like relief. Multiple studies on habit and identity note that consistency becomes far more likely once a behavior lines up with how you see yourself. The classic finding being that once the identity shifts, the behavior stops requiring constant self-management. But stops requiring management isn't the same as stops being hard. It just moves the difficulty somewhere else. Instead of negotiating with yourself every single day about whether today is a writing day, you're negotiating, less often but more intensely, with the parts of your identity that don't want to be exposed to judgment at all. That's a real trade, and it's worth knowing you're making it rather than being ambushed by it a few months in and mistaking the new difficulty for proof you chose wrong. What I'd actually do with this. So here's what I'd actually do with all of this if I were standing where you might be standing. I wouldn't wait for the fear to go away because the data says it mostly won't. Not for a long while and definitely not before you start. I wouldn't wait to feel like the identity is earned because the research says it works the other way. The identity comes first, small and unconvincing, and the earning happens after in arrears. And I would go looking deliberately for other people already standing in that same unproven, self-appointed place because the evidence keeps saying the same thing from a dozen different angles. Identity held alone erodes, and identity held in company tends to last. The moment you decide to take your art seriously, nothing about your work changes. But the frame around the work changes completely, and it turns out the frame was doing most of the load-bearing work all along.